Hi folks. In this video, I'm going to review Chapter 8. For those of you who are in my class on international business, you may have wondered why we look at Chapter 8 after we've already looked at Chapter 10. Chapter 10, as I hope you remember, is about international strategy or international business strategy. And in that chapter, you will recall that we went over the steps of international business planning. And you may recall that there are three basic steps. First, gathering evidence. Second, making decisions. And third, implementing those decisions, mainly by implementing strategy. The decisions being to form goals and then strategy to pursue those goals. In Chapter 8, the authors provide us with some information about how to gather evidence about the international business environment. And so it logically should follow the introduction of steps in business planning. So in my view, they sort of got this backwards. In this course, I hope that I'm presenting the information to you in a somewhat more logical fashion. So with that, let me just get the PowerPoint slides up on the screen and we'll get going. I might add that this is a pretty basic chapter. It's not real complicated. It doesn't have nearly the breadth of information that Chapter 10 does, for instance. So we should be able to step through it a little faster. And there are really just three basic elements of fact gathering, three procedures that we can linger on more than anything else in order to explore these methods of gathering evidence that the authors provide us. So with that, let's get the slides here. Just give me a second to do that. And there they are. Okay, so here we are with Chapter 8. And although the title is International Expansion and Global Market Opportunity Assessment, this is really about gathering evidence with which to make decisions about international strategic planning. So let me see if I can get this. I always seem to have trouble getting the slides moving here. And so here's the diagram that you remember seeing when we discussed Chapter 10. Three steps of the strategic planning process. And we're talking here in Chapter 8 about some methods to carry on the work in that first step, where we gather evidence with which to make decisions about selecting goals, strategic objectives, and strategy itself. Before doing that, the authors run through some conceptual ideas about due diligence, just what the scope of all this evidence is, and when we gather evidence about the environment where we're going to do business internationally. And it's really the scope of this information that makes international business international. So we're very interested in the differences in business conditions between countries and regions, differences between consumers, attitudes and preferences, what the capabilities, economies, industry dynamics, and so forth in one country might be compared to others. So the first of those three methods that I mentioned, and they're not just three, but there are three really important ones. And the first one is the so-called pastel analysis. And really, this is an exploded version of Porter's diamond. Remember, Porter's diamond, if you've gone through chapter 10 with me, talks about the factor conditions, demand conditions, related industries, and rivalry. Here, instead of 4 dimensions, we look at 6: political, economic, sociocultural, technological, environmental, and legal. And those of us in the profession see that there are lots of interrelationships between political and economic, for instance. Certainly sociocultural and so-called environmental factors have a lot to do with market conditions. So in our review of chapter 10, I spoke with you about factor conditions, which frankly we don't see here, and that's maybe is a limitation. But after that, we talked about market conditions, and in market conditions, of course, that we might draw conclusions about sociocultural influences on the demand, the nature of demand for our products and services, and as well as technological and political influences, and so forth. So although pastel appears by its nomenclature, by the number of letters, to be different than what we find in Porter's diamond, it actually is about the same, with the limitation that pastel doesn't really get into factor conditions the way that Porter does. So give that some thought. In any event, the authors of your textbook suggest that you take a look at each of those dimensions and consider their relevance to your particular case. And then once you've identified variables in each one of those 6 dimensions, identify and collect the information that is relevant and analyze it and draw conclusions. Quite frankly, this isn't what I would consider to be a real sophisticated approach to gathering evidence about the external environment. But okay, consider the relevance of each factor, gather information about each factor, and then draw your conclusions. So at this point, the authors get into the notion of globalization as opposed to industries that are not globalized. Remember, some industries are multinational in nature, some may be global, some even may be a combination of those two, transnational in nature. But if an industry has unique characteristics, or rather common characteristics worldwide, that enables you as a strategist to do business in a much more economic and generalized fashion. So for those conditions to be met in your markets, you're looking for homogeneous customer needs, global customer needs, global channels of distribution, marketing methods that are applicable in multiple countries. You're also hoping to find that scale economies exist, that when you do business on a larger scale, you can spread the costs of doing business across a larger scope of business and a larger volume of business so that the unit costs come down. And wherever you gain experience and learn, that learning and that experience can be transferred throughout the global network where you do business. Similarly, it's helpful if you can purchase the raw materials in multiple locations and do it in such a way that it's less costly, perhaps because you can minimize transportation or distribution costs because you can purchase goods and services that are required by your business close to where you deliver the ultimate product or service that you're offering customers, and thus favorable logistics. Arbitrage opportunities simply mean that you can take your products or services that are generated perhaps midway through the value chain and deliver them elsewhere to get added value for with a minimum cost, basically being able to take one value or service, deliver it elsewhere, and leverage its value where it's delivered. To the extent that research and development costs are high, then it's great if you could do those activities in centralized locations and share them on a worldwide basis. Alternatively, if the R&D, with an emphasis on the D, development of the mechanics of your product or your process can be developed locally in local manufacturing facilities and thereby provide quick service, quick results, then sometimes locating them throughout the enterprise rather than centrally and having to go to the difficulty and cost of getting them from the central location to the field operations. It may be better if you can locate them in the field. So you can benefit when research and development costs either can be centralized in a great big organization, such as chemicals. You don't need to have a chemicals laboratory in every location where a chemical company manufactures chemicals when it's developing new chemicals. On the other hand, the way in which those chemicals are mixed and packaged and so forth may need to be developed to capitalize on or adapt to environmental conditions, in which case there's a development cost to modify the product or service to the local requirements. And if those costs are high, it's great that you can produce them in a local at a local level and avoid particularly the costs of distribution, the delays, and so forth. Other factors favoring globalization, of course, could be favorable government policies with regard to trade, technology, regulations, and so forth. If countries, if countries are interdependent, if you're, for instance, able to manufacture a product in one country and then deliver it and use it in multiple countries within a region, you can capitalize on their interdependence. This will provide both economies and enable a competitor to compete at a lower cost. So global competitors are often seeking to compete on a least cost basis. And to do that, you need to capitalize on countries' markets' interdependence. Okay, this takes us to the next topic, which is not one of the big three, by the way, but rather it's a comment that is made in this chapter about importing. And it's just a cute little play on words to say that importing is a, quote, stealth form of internationalization. And what the authors are attempting to say here is that although companies and in a particular local domestic industry may think that their businesses are not international in nature, they still may be without knowing it, because the products that they use to produce their products, or even the services that are used to market them, may be imported. They may be generated in other countries. And if that's the case, then all these bullets on this slide apply. You just don't bring import the product into the country without clearing customs. Now, it may be that the company that your company buys these products from doesn't require you to meet customs requirements, but before it sells the products that you buy from it, before it sells those products to you, but either to manufacture its product or to gain it before it distributes it to you, along with other products you might obtain from it, in order to meet or to fulfill the recipe for whatever it is that you're manufacturing. That supplier that you deal with well may have had to meet customs requirements. So there are a whole lot of factors that go into importing products from outside your home country. And so, although you may not know it, you're doing business internationally. And so there are some considerations, things to take into consideration once you realize that much of what goes on in your business may have ties back to other countries. And these bullet points are topics that may come into play. Fraud could be one. You may be getting a raw material that you think is a good one, when in fact it doesn't meet the kind of standards that could exist and be imposed on domestic manufacturers. This sometimes occurs in the chemicals and medical products. Various approaches to meeting the requirements of imported products to be sure that such things don't happen, of course, is also important. There are various financing and insurance issues and so forth. including foreign trade zones, where it's easier to bring products in from outside your home country. So these are simply some considerations that managers need to have when they are using imported products. And then here we have sort of an extension, a bit of a reach when we're talking about importing. And that's because these words can be used for purposes of discussing importing as well as other things. In any event, outsourcing is the term that we use when we decide not to do a thing in our value chain ourselves, but instead to have another company do it. And that thing doesn't have to be manufacturing of a component product. Business process outsourcing happens a lot these days, more and more. So it's often impressive to see just how much, what a large portion of U.S. income tax returns are actually prepared by firms in India. Whether your income tax is for yourself or perhaps a small business, when you take your papers to your local accountant, that accountant may load everything into a software package, press a button, and automatically all that data goes to a computer bank in perhaps California or some other state. And in that computer bank, the company ID or your social security number is removed. A random ID number is attached, and from there, that packet of information is distributed electronically to a firm in India where highly educated people, because there are so many of them, will work for a relatively low compensation. And they'll do the work on your income tax returns and prepare the forms and then load them back into the system, which goes back to California, sees that random ID number and replaces it with the original company ID or social security number, after which it is transmitted back to your local accountant's office. The accountant didn't do the computations, but rather someone else in India did. That's an outsourcing of income tax preparation, lots of accounting, lots of other administrative services, and the scope of which might amaze you, are outsourced to other firms, often in other countries. You and I have both picked up the telephone and asked for information about perhaps our travel or our computer or what have you. And lo and behold, we end up talking with someone in India or another country where the company that we bought our PC from or whatever the product might have been has decided that providing customer service doesn't add enough value, but still needs to be done. It just that if it's done internally, no competitive advantage is realized by the company. It just has to do it. And so it outsources those particular services to firms in other countries where the people who will work less expensively and yet do a completely adequate job, probably with the benefit of computer services that are produced in another country. Offshoring is not outsourcing. Offshoring is where we take our function and that we want to perform. It may be manufacturing, probably is manufacturing, but it can be other record-keeping functions, for instance. But we'll move it to another country. In some technologically intensive industries, it's been discovered that some research and development of electronic products, for instance, can be done less expensively and sometimes with better results in other countries, because in those countries, technology is moved at a rapid rate, and there is plenty of talent to do this work. By way of example, General Electric has developed some CAT scan products in other countries, particularly CAT scan machines that are used in China. And those products are developed closer to China. Yet it turned out that those same machines can be used in large quantity in the United States. So it simply is, has been discovered by a lot of companies that entire manufacturing processes or services and service bureaus, service centers conducted by IBM, for instance, have been relocated to India. I believe IBM's largest or second largest service center is now located in India. And that simply is because it wants to take advantage of proximity to the market, relatively affordable talent, and proximity to other markets, perhaps in Asia. So there are a lot of reasons why companies that have a value chain with several steps in it may take one of those steps and move it to other countries, more than one other country, so that those activities are located closer to the foreign markets where they're going to be needed. And so anyway, that's business process outsourcing. It simply is taking what we do and keep it, we don't give it up as we do in outsourcing. In outsourcing, we turn something over to another country and say, here, you do this. And offshoring, we keep doing it, but we do it outside our home country. International outsourcing, and what I've been describing is international outsourcing. These authors have said that international outsourcing refers to both outsourcing and offshoring, or outsourcing to a non-domestic third party. I think that's you know, I'm not real comfortable with that choice of terms. I think that the key to international outsourcing is that it simply acknowledges that a lot of outsourcing initially was done within the home country. It simply turned out that some steps in the value chain didn't add a lot of value, and it worked out better for companies if they turned it over to specialists who were located in the same country. But today we're finding out that there are specialists in functions outside our home country that could actually do something better than we can do it in our home country, as I explained earlier, perhaps simply because it's closer to the ultimate market destination. Okay, now we move to some tables that both in these slides prepared by the publisher, as well as your textbook, are regrettably faint. They're hard to read because the print isn't very dark. You can read them better in your book than you can on these slides. But this slide simply summarizes the modes or the methods of moving outside your home country and in doing business. First is exporting, where we simply produce the product at home and sell it in other countries. And as you can see, that's a pretty quick way to get into other countries, but you give up a lot, not least of which is control. You don't really get a lot of feedback from the market about how your product is viewed by the customers, and you still have to pay to transport it to get it there and to have someone distribute it for you. Licensing and franchising is also fast and relatively low in cost. Once again, you're giving up control. Worse, the licensee, that is the company that licenses your process or knowledge, while things are going on, it could be just fine, you know, for all of the product that they make with your method, your patented method perhaps, will generate a fee for your company, usually called a royalty. On the other hand, it may be that the country where this is being done doesn't enforce patents or contracts that provide for royalties. And even worse, the company that licenses your technique eventually may just duplicate it in another facility and put a different brand name on the product, and you don't even know it. And but in that case, your so-called partner is cheating, and you are not getting the royalties that you deserve. In the case of a partner or strategic alliance, you're now sharing costs and risks. This would be true when you're entering a new market and you don't feel that you understand the market enough to go it alone. So you get a partner who you think does understand the market very well. Perhaps that partner distributes consumer products, but they don't have a product like yours and they'd like to have one. And so you and your partner share in the cost of building a plant or otherwise developing the capability to produce that product and distribute it and advertise it and so forth. So you are incurring more cost, but you're getting more control. The problem is that you're still dependent upon that other party. But partnering and strategic alliances are very popular ways to move into other countries, and a lot of it goes on. Acquisitions simply mean that your company buys another company. In my experience as a consultant, as well as a strategic planning officer, I have bought a lot of companies for my employer or for my clients, both in the United States, here at home, and elsewhere. It's a little trickier. You got to know what you're doing, and you can sometimes move fast. I'm not sure the authors I've stated the case quite right here. Sometimes it's not fast. Sometimes it can be quite painstaking to do an international acquisition. But once you buy the company, if that company is already established and has a management team that understands your market and the way that industry is conducted in a particular country, you should be on pretty good ground. But you still have the problem, first of all, of paying the price to buy the company. If it's a good company, you're not going to get it cheap. You're going to have to pay a premium, which makes it worthwhile for the existing owners, whether they're public shareholders or private owners, to part with their ownership. And even then, once you have the company, you have to figure out how to integrate it with the other elements of your corporation. And that can be a challenge when you're working across borders. And finally, the so-called greenfield venture, where instead of buying a new company, you basically buy the land or the buildings and start a business fresh in a new country. You would make such a venture in the event that there's an entirely new product, an entirely new process, something that companies in that country that you want to enter don't already know how to do. So you're taking a lot of risk because you not only don't have a lot of familiarity usually with the market or perhaps the regulators, but you're hoping that once you build this new facility and start making this product, that everything is going to turn out all right, and that that your workforce is going to be cooperative and so forth. On the other hand, if this is a new process and a new product, and you can launch it successfully, and no one else has that kind of capability in the country that you're entering with your greenfield product venture, then you may have great competitive advantage and great potential for profit, but you're taking a big gamble when you do that. So the risk due to the unknown, as this exhibit states. Okay, so at this point, the slide simply summarizes these options that we've just gone over. You can review them at your leisure when you go over the PowerPoints, when you print them out, but I don't think there's any real need to repeat them for you here again. This takes us to the second of the three big devices for gathering evidence about the environment that you're going to build your business in. So throughout this chapter, we're talking about gathering evidence. And when we're talking about these options here, all of these options, we're talking about gathering evidence to clarify which of them, which of these various options for entering an industry we care to choose. We're trying to clarify alternatives. One framework for clarifying alternatives that can be very useful is a device developed by a guy named Pankaj Ghemawat, an Indian fellow who is a professor at Harvard. And he has written extensively about international business and international strategy. And he came up with this CAGE acronym, which is short for Culture, Administration, Geography, and Economics. And he explains that these are the dimensions of differences between your home country and the country that you're thinking about entering. So in order to make a decision whether or not to enter an industry, you want to ask yourself what the distance, quote, distance is between your country and that country. And he proposes that there can be a long distance or perhaps a short one between your home country and the intended destination in terms of culture, the administrative or paperwork, regulatory requirements that are required to do business across borders, the simple geographic distance and characteristics of the topography, the highway system and so forth in your country versus that one. Because in some industries, it's very important to be able to distribute the product to the end user sometimes quite rapidly if the product happens to be perishable, for instance, if it's a food product or medicine. And finally, economics is the discretionary spending power in the target country that is adequate for a market to exist. And so once again, we have these hard to read diagrams. I really don't know why the publisher permitted these hard to read diagrams to be put into your textbook, let alone these slides. I tried to copy them and darken the print, and I couldn't do it, or I would have. So all I can do is apologize to you on behalf of the publisher for the poor quality of this exhibit, and it's poor. In any event, we see in this exhibit simply some descriptions of these four dimensions of distance between your home country and the destination. So what could generate cultural distance? Obviously the languages, ethnicities, the history of the country, how it grew up to be the way it is, the social networks. Religion obviously would make a big difference, and social norms. In terms of administration, that's a tough term to grapple with because it could mean so many things. Sometimes, as the authors point out, for instance, the British moved from England to other countries, and when they did, they took their methods of doing business, their language, their conventions, commercial conventions with them. And so it's easy still to transfer, to conduct business across borders between the UK and countries that the UK formed, that England formed as the UK and others over the years. But it's not just the UK. The Dutch did a lot of internationalizing. So did the Italians. And so over time, it became possible for companies in Holland or Italy to do business in other countries because businesses that were located in those countries established businesses in countries where that the home country had expanded and established colonies, perhaps. So to the extent that there are shared monetary or political conventions, that shortens the distance or lowers the barrier. On the other hand, if those shared monetary and political standards, just in the case when those colonial ties don't exist, then there's a distance that separates the home country from the target country. And so we have political, government policies, institutions, paperwork, taxation, and so on. So there can be a lot of administrative reasons why it's difficult to do business across borders. To the extent that they are not present, then that makes it easier. Geographic difference is pretty much just exactly what it sounds like. But they show up in different ways. If you're doing business across borders, for instance, between the United States and Canada, or the United States and Mexico, that's a lot different from when we're doing business between the United States and India, for instance. Then there's no common border. That makes it tougher. And it may be that some products are perishable or are very costly to transport across long distances, in which case geographic distance can be a real problem and can make it difficult to do business across borders or internationally. And then economic, quote, distance. See, it's not really a physical distance, is it? It's a conceptual distance that we're talking about. When GDP per capita in one country is a lot lower than another, then at a minimum, you're going to have to change the costliness of your product so it's affordable in that other country. And there are a lot of differences in costs and quality of everything from raw materials to the services that are required to do business. And whether it's taxation, GDP per capita, the rate of inflation, and so forth, all of these are contributors to economic distance. And so we can take those distances and apply them to product categories, to appreciate product categories where such distances can make a big difference. So if television programming, for instance, is kind of difficult to put across borders because of language differences or perhaps even transmission standards. So broadcasting is affected by cultural differences and distances. Administrative distances, as you can see, there are a lot of them on this slide, and they are meant to reflect all the different types of administrative or bureaucratic barriers that can exist to make it difficult to do business between countries. For instance, down about a little bit more than halfway down the list, you see national champions. In this country, an airline can't be owned more than 25% by a I'm sorry, that's a broadcaster. No, it's an airline. Broadcasters cannot be owned by foreign owners either. So even in this country, some industries are protected from foreign ownership. And in different countries, different rules and regulations apply, and they throw up administrative barriers to entering those countries. We've already talked about the geographic distance and the impact that can have on products that have that are expensive to transport, such as cement. So after a while, the cost of transporting cement becomes greater than the value of the cement itself. So you just can't really do much business across borders with cement. In other cases, the product could be perishable. Food products come immediately to mind. And then there's the economic distance where, different nations, populations are more or less wealthy and therefore can afford more or less expensive, in this case, cars. And here we have in this slide simply more of the same. Notice that there's nothing more about administrative distances, but there are more comments about industries and products that are affected by cultural distances, geographic distances. There are the perishable products, and economic distances. And I'll let you review these tables at your leisure. Everything in them is relevant, but what you really should be doing is looking for distances, whether they're on this table, this one, or this one, that apply to the case that you and your teammates are doing. Because in my courses on international business, teams are formed, and those teams analyze companies in their international business situations. And we would want to do a cage analysis to appreciate differences between the home country and the countries where either business is done now or might be done in the future. And when we're using CAGE to assess differences or distances between the home country and the foreign country, then every time one of these barriers is substantial, there's a requirement to form a strategy to overcome or neutralize those barriers. So the one of the barriers that often can exist is the absence of intermediaries. And so your textbook authors have focused on that issue all by itself. So in some industries, such as finance, but it could be distribution in many different functions of business, intermediaries are required to conduct business functions. The classic example, I suppose, would be the international custom broker that takes your product, if you're going to export, and handles its clearance of customs, getting on a ship, being transported to another country, where another broker will take it from there. So very often we need these intermediaries to accomplish international business. And to the extent that those intermediaries do not exist, that can really throw up some barriers, or what Gemawat calls distances. And so here's another one of these hard to read tables that simply gives you some illustrations of intermediaries that exist in financial markets, where you can see several illustrations. I might add that venture capital firms is not, or how should I say it, all these other items under venture capital firms are not subsidiaries of venture capital firms. They're all equally important. Markets for management talent, not as often, not important as often as in the financial markets. Markets for products, no doubt about it. Intermediaries certainly are often important, and certainly in legal and regulatory domains, we often need intermediaries. Okay, how do you handle these voids when you've got an absence of infrastructure to support your industry? The first thing that the textbook suggests is that you can adapt your business model to that country that you want to enter. And on page 282 of your textbook, you'll find a discussion of how McDonald's wanted to be in Russia, but it didn't find everything it needed. And that means processed beef, the packaging, just a whole lot of the bread, grains, and so forth, baking. And so over a period of time, McDonald's actually jumped right in to help agribusinesses form and produce the products that it needed to offer quick service meals to customers in Russia. So if you and your team happen to be looking at McDonald's as the company that you're studying, you really ought to take a look at page 282. And I think there are a couple of references in that chapter, but you really ought to check this out because it's a classic illustration of how to enter a new market in a very large, broad-based way. It took McDonald's some time and a lot of capital to develop the infrastructure that it needed to do business, and it had to adapt its business model in order to ultimately get going in Russia. But it obviously decided that that investment was worthwhile, and so it did so. Clearly, only a large company can make a venture like this, and it would only do so in a large market. But in this particular case, McDonald's did just that. It virtually helped Russia develop its agribusiness industry. The same page, by the way, and I should change this one. It's big 4 with a capital F. There we go. But there are 4 large auditing and accounting firms in the United States. And they all wanted to enter Brazil. The problem is that Brazil's business climate and its regulatory environment wasn't very demanding. And yet the companies in Brazil wanted the services of these auditing firms in order to be more acceptable internationally. And the big 4 auditing firms indeed did end up going into Brazil, but they then succeeded in elevating reporting and auditing standards. And so they changed the institutional context, the standards, if you will, that firms in their industry had to comply with, had to meet in order to be acceptable in that industry. So that's the second way to deal with institutional voids, to change the institutional context. And finally, on that same page, you'll find a very brief statement that if it may come to be that you just can't, and I think there is an illustration on that page, but long story short, there are some countries where it simply may not be acceptable to do business because the institutional voids are too great, and the standards for doing business acceptably don't exist. Okay, there's a quick slide here referring to SWOT, and it basically makes the point. You see, this is chapter 8, and chapter 10 hasn't arrived yet. And so the author introduces the notion of SWOT without getting into it in detail, because they do so in chapter 10. But they say when you do a SWOT, when you do strategic planning, see, this is really out of sequence in the textbook. You're going to need to gather evidence to make planning decisions. You're going to have to gather evidence about internal capabilities, strengths and weaknesses, and problems, opportunities, and threats in the external environment. And so they simply make the case here that I offered you at the beginning of this video, and that is that this chapter is all about gathering evidence to do strategic planning with. And this takes us to the third and final method for doing fact gathering, or gathering evidence with which to make strategic decisions. And that's scenario analysis, so-called. I do and have done a lot of scenario, like the word scenario planning is not a well-chosen word, but I've done a lot of contingency planning with clients, and to do that, we have formed scenarios. We have considered alternative futures. Futures for the external environment in which we do business that are not the ones that we're going to base our prevailing plan on. We have to make our best guess about the economy, market, and industry and technology with which we're going to do business today. But the longer in the future we look, the more the chance we have of being wrong, of conditions changing and requiring our firm to alter its strategy accordingly. Exactly when and how that's going to happen is a matter of conjecture. It's uncertain. It's very messy. And so we use scenarios. That is, the word scenario is actually taken from broadcasting and from plays in a play or a movie, if you will. There's a little framework or a little piece of action where something takes place, some particular set of activities takes place around some issue. That's a scenario. So that term has been applied here to talk about the combination of circumstances that determine what our appropriate behavior as a company ought to be, whether it's the application of resources or the selection of locations to do business in. So it's all about adapting our strategy to changing business conditions. The technique that you see here, or the steps that you see here, are pretty straightforward. But in real contingency planning, what we do is we frame out, we form several scenarios, that is, combinations of changed business conditions. And then we evaluate them. What would be the impact of these changes on our ability to do business, on the competitive environment, on our competitors' abilities to do business, on opportunities for greater or less profit? So the 6 steps that you see here are the author's suggestions, and they're not bad, for going through the process of contingency planning. Each scenario, each combination of changed business conditions is a contingency. Contingency planning then tries to acknowledge that in the future, business conditions won't be as they are now. And then for each of those contingencies, frame out a strategy that is appropriate. Usually we'll do that, make this contingent strategy in just broad strokes. We won't go to all the work of developing it in detail like we do the prevailing plan, but instead we'll just frame it out broadly. As time passes, we'll do what's called environmental scanning. We'll watch the environment change over time. And if one of these contingencies looks like it's becoming more likely, then we'll frame out that contingent strategy in greater detail until finally that contingency may be more likely than the assumptions in our prevailing plan. At that point, we switch out those assumptions and we switch in the new scenario, the new set of assumptions about the external environment, and alter our strategy accordingly by adopting the contingent strategies that we've been developing. The neat thing about this method is that it avoids panic planning, is what I call it. But you know very well that when you're caught by surprise, you're not as clear-headed as you might be if you have a chance to think things through ahead of time and plan what you're going to do, as opposed to just doing it very rapidly in sort of a panic mode because you got caught by surprise. Chances are that if you have a chance to work the problem through deliberately in a deliberate fashion, you will come out with a better reasoning and a greater likelihood of success. That's why we do contingency planning, which these authors call scenario planning. So their 6 steps are choose the issue, what's your question? And by the way, we can do the research. I mean, this is really sort of a research method. So the researcher says, I'd like to look into a particular kind of problem. Perhaps it has to do with an economy of a particular country growing rapidly or not. Maybe a country gets occupied by another country. Maybe this conflict that's going on between countries today results in a change of the political system in a particular country. So we ask questions. What would happen if something takes place? So we choose that issue and frame it out. Then this word brainstorm, I don't like that word at all, but we identify what the drivers, what the key variables are going to be that are going to be the decision-making criteria in this particular scenario, and try ultimately to get it into as specific as possible. So item number 3 on this list is to define 2 dimensions of greatest uncertainty. In fact, this is a research method where we can look at combinations of uncertain variables that are puzzling us. So after you choose 2 dimensions and analyze their impacts on each other, you could choose 2 more. You might even look at 3 at the same time, but that's about as many as you can handle, it turns out. We've tried, there's been a lot of writing about this method, and believe me, when you get up to 3 dimensions, it gets pretty complicated. And then fourth, you spell out the combinations of plus or minus on each of 2 dimensions, and you get 4 quadrants. Then fifthly, identify indicators that could signal which scenario is unfolding favorably or unfavorably among those 4. And then assess them, draw your conclusions. And based on that, develop contingency plans, scenarios, plans for responding to each scenario. The chapter concludes by pointing out that what you're looking for here is to assess factors that are uncertain. As we go through this analysis, we'll find some variables that behave in a more predictable way because they represent trends that we can anticipate. Maybe not with perfect accuracy, but we can forecast for instance, the population of an age group. How many people in a particular country are going to be between the ages of 40 and 50 10 years from now? Well, those people are between 30 and 40 today, right? So we because of demographics, we can have a pretty accurate forecast. And there are a lot of things in environments that we can analyze pretty specifically and forecast. Scenario forecasting can take that, or forming of scenarios, scenario forecasting, can certainly take those into consideration and evaluate their impacts on our future business conditions. But where scenario forecasting and contingency planning really pays off is when we deal with these variables that have a broader range of possibilities, greater uncertainty. Well, that's it. I don't know whether I can get this thing to come off the screen or not. Let me just I usually end up just closing the whole thing. And there we go. So now you and I are back together. So that's it for Chapter 8. And the three major ways of gathering evidence to be used for international strategic planning. Pastel, which is simply a more extensive version of the diamond without looking at factor conditions. So it's just another framework of variables to be assessed that tries to cover the whole gamut of possibilities. Cage, which is more specific and gets right to the point of barriers to move into another country from your home country. And then scenario forecasting and contingency planning, where we take into consideration the scope of alternative futures so that we can have an inventory of prepared responses. And then as time passes and we scan the external environment, we can make some decisions about changes that are becoming more likely, because eventually the assumptions that we've made today, some of them are going to become outdated. We're going to have to adapt this plan continuously. And scenario forecasting and contingency planning allows us to keep up with the changes. And as a consequence, do our planning in a much more deliberate, rational, hopefully coherent fashion. And so with that, I'm going to let you get back to work. And I hope that this video has been useful to you in reviewing Chapter 8. Goodbye.